Good morning. Welcome to Bible study. We are finishing up the book of Esther today, so that'll be a lot of fun. We'll talk about how the story concludes, how Queen Esther appealed to the king, and then the king decides that, yeah, you're right, Esther, we need to protect you and the Jews. He mostly is there to protect his wife and then listen to her. But then Haman is then executed in Mordecai's place. So Haman and his family decided that they were going to hang Mordecai in the gallows. And then everything seems to flip around, and instead Mordecai will end up in the place of honor. And even as the book wraps up, we'll see that Mordecai ends up basically second in command like Haman was. So we'll see that there's this great reversal that happens in the book of Esther, where Haman is replaced by Mordecai. Let's go and open with a word of prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you for watching over us. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to read your word. Guide us as we read the book of Esther. Help it to be fruitful for us, and remind us of your love for your people, that you protect all of us, your people, and that you even bring us home to be with you. We ask this in your name. Amen. Let's go ahead and begin where we left off. So 2 weeks ago, we were in Esther chapter 6, I believe, and then now we are moving on to Esther chapter 7. While they're yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not compared with the loss to the king." Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, the wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So we have the second feast now, and the king asked Queen Esther what her request is. So she's put on this big feast for them, and it's just Haman and King Xerxes, but she's put on this big feast, and so the king wants to reward her. Keep in mind, Haman is also very happy to be at this feast because it's just him and the king and the queen. So this looks really good for him. Things look like, oh, they're going to go really well for me. They're going to keep loving me and lavishing me with all these gifts, and that I might still have to bribe the king every now and then, but I will certainly have a very, very, very high place in the royalty. So Haman is most likely thinking, as many advisors like this did back in those days and even today, is, well, how high can I ascend? Because what happens is you either go one of two paths. You either basically are in complete custody of the king and care of the king, where you're his second-hand man, where basically as long as the king is in control, you're in control, and that's a big benefit to you. The other route that these advisors go, and this goes off the phrase, keep your friends close, your enemies closer, is that Haman one day would think about backstabbing the king, that if he had enough force and enough power, he could even rival the king himself. So that would be the other option for Haman's ascent and trajectory, what thoughts might be going on inside of Haman's mind. But none of that will happen because the queen will turn on him. So what no one expected, especially Haman, was that Queen Esther was a Jew. She was even related to Mordecai. He didn't know any of this. He didn't know that Mordecai and Esther were cousins, that Mordecai raised Esther. So this would be a complete shock to him that all of a sudden she's talking about this decree that went out through all the land, and she's asking the king to overturn it. And then she's even implicating Haman as the mastermind behind this plot. And so Haman is quickly realizing that this isn't a good opportunity. This is a bad moment, a very bad moment in his life, because he just walked right into a trap. That Esther used Haman's own pride as a way to trap him and get him alone with the king, and then to basically convict him of this, not of this crime, you could say, crime against humanity, because technically it's not a crime against the land because it was the law of the land, but it was, of course, a crime against God and his people. So this is where we're at. That Queen Esther, she of course turns on Haman, stands up for her own people, and then the king is immediately angry at this. What I find fascinating is that line in verse 4, "If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. for our affliction is not compared with the loss to the king. That's very interesting. So that she's admitting that she wouldn't have done this if it was only slavery. I wonder if she's telling the truth or if she's lying here, because she could be lying once again just to butter the king up to make him more likely to do what she wants. And so it like simply removing the people's rights, lowering them to slavery. They're still alive at least, and so she may not have fought as strongly. I find that very interesting, and I wonder, was she telling the truth or not there, or was she simply buttering the king up? It's a fascinating line. We don't know, though. We don't know what was going on inside her mind, because she could be very well telling the truth. Remember, Mordecai had to talk her in to going into the king's chambers to begin with, so she might be telling the truth. So it's an interesting line regardless. So you can take whatever way you take that line however you wish, I guess. There's not a lot of evidence supporting what her thoughts were one way or the other. But it's fascinating nonetheless. But she points out Haman as the one who called this into being, and now she's urging the king to do something about it. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned to the palace garden, a place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the wrath of the king abated. So the king's angry, but what's fascinating is he goes out into the palace garden. So his wrath from wine drinking, it says. You get the idea. He would have been angry no matter what, but because he had been drinking, the anger was even worse. So he goes out into the palace garden. It doesn't say why. Is it just that he's so angry he's trying to walk it off maybe? Or I think it's more likely he's grabbing extra guards. He's just grabbing the guards to get Haman. And because we remember from last week, this was a meal just between the three of them, between King Xerxes, Queen Esther, and Haman. So it's likely that there may have been guards present at first, but they're not thinking Haman's going to do anything. And besides, this was a feast performed by Queen Esther, given by Queen Esther. So the chances of poisoning are very, very low to minimal. There probably are minimal guards, maybe no one at all in attendance. So he's going to go and grab people to go and arrest Haman and decide what to do with him. So then when the king comes back, Haman, of course, is begging for his life. He's begging for mercy from Queen Esther because he realizes his life is in her hands, and he wants mercy, but he doesn't deserve mercy. He is convicted, or he is given over the whole Jewish race to death in Persia. So this is complete genocide. So the queen is saying, "No, you're dangerous." Think about even how he was just acting personally towards Mordecai, how he had such a personal vendetta against him. In such a weird way of going about it too, where instead of getting justice immediately for Mordecai not bowing down to him, instead he waits a full year to execute Mordecai, and he chooses it's proper to execute their entire race. It's just wrong. So he's very wrathful, and so he's dangerous to keep around. And so the king, of course, is going to listen to the queen and have Haman executed. And so you get this sense of extreme poetic justice, where the gallows that Haman made for Mordecai, well, now those very gallows are used on Haman himself. And then the wrath of the king is abated, as that last verse says in chapter 7. So like I was saying about the king going in guards, they covered Haman's face. So when they come in, he's falling onto Queen Esther. So it's an odd way of saying it, but I take it to mean that he's falling down like prostrate, like offering himself, like, "Hey, please have mercy on me." But either he fell in a weird way where he literally fell onto her, or he was just too close to Queen Esther, and the king just takes that as another slight. Basically, the king's already mad. His mind's made up. He's going to execute Haman, and he's just looking for more reasons to do it. So regardless of what Haman was doing, his life is forfeit. The king's going to execute him. That's it. And so any kind of proximity to Queen Esther is going to make him even more mad, and you can see how he immediately just has him executed that very night. So there's no real trial or anything. He just goes and is executed. This once again shows the power of the king. So his guards just go and do what he says, and that Haman is put to death. So he is put to death that very night. So now that Haman is dead, you would think that the Jewish people are saved, but no. We actually have chapter 8 where the queen has to once again ask the king to remove that edict, because there's still the edict to kill all the Jews. That hasn't changed. Remember, that was signed with the royal signet ring. So that is a law of the land, that even though Haman, the mastermind behind this plot, is dead, the Jewish people are still threatened by this royal decree. So we'll read chapter 8 now. On the day King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy. On that day, King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had been told what he was. For Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So we see more fortunes be reversed. So King Xerxes, he gives the house of Haman to Esther. So now she is in control of it, which would mean she's not just in control of the goods, but she's even in control of the servants and the people, where she's kind of seen as an authority even over his family, perhaps even. So you have this giving of goods from Haman's family to Esther, where she can choose what to do with all that. She can make Haman's wife and children live in squalor if she wished, because everything is hers now. So you see how things are changing. Also, Mordecai came before the king. So the king summons Mordecai. Esther tells the king who Mordecai is. And he goes, well, wait, so this is a relative. This is basically your parent, Esther. Let's take care of him. So he takes off the signet ring and gives it to Mordecai. So it was actually given to Haman first. So he removes the ring from Haman's hand and then gives it to Mordecai. So he's essentially setting Mordecai in the place of Haman. And this is once again to thank Mordecai for saving his life. And I think the king is showing a lot of respect to Mordecai here, because Mordecai saved him earlier. So you have that story way back at the beginning of the book where there's these two people plotting, these two servants plotting to kill the king, and Mordecai stops it. And so Mordecai was once rewarded by being paraded through the streets with Haman leading the horse. But now it seems like, well, Mordecai, you seem pretty wise. You encourage Esther to do all of this. You seem pretty good and wise in what you're doing. Let's go ahead and reward you even more by putting you in Haman's place. So now that Haman has been removed from this second in command position, now Mordecai is put there. And Esther puts Mordecai in charge of the house of Haman. So the very person that the house of Haman had decided to kill, now he is in charge of the house of Haman. And so that's not what they want at all. So this is really bad if you're in the house of Haman, but this is really good for the Jewish people. Next, verse 3. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, if it please the king, if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are all in the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman. I have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it in the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and seal of the king's ring cannot be revoked. So, like I was saying, technically that edict was not revoked yet. So he took out his vengeance on Haman. So think of it more as personal. That Haman had attacked the queen. So that was the real reason why Haman was murdered. So like he was upset too about what Queen Esther was saying. Remember, he was originally driven to wrath because Queen Esther was saying, Haman's trying to kill me and the rest of my people. But then he saw Haman get too close to the queen, and so he executes him for that reason. And so the king needs to be reminded that there's still this plot to kill the Jews. So once again, Esther bravely goes to the king's chambers, And the king holds out the golden scepter because he loves his queen. He's not going to execute her because she's in his chambers or in his court. So she asks that he revoke this plot. And he says, well, he points out that Mordecai has the signet ring now. So you can write whatever it is you want. That's kind of the attitude you get here. So, excuse me. In verse 8, you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, name the king and seal it with the king's ring. So like he's saying, hey, like I gave you the ring, so you can go and do this. So go and revoke it. So as long as it's in my name and with the seal of the king, then it's going to be followed. And so you can still revoke a law as long as the king is the one revoking it. So then that way the Jews would be saved. And so verse 9. Then the king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews. So the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Xerxes and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses and were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to go and gather and defend their lives, destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods on one day throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, and on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And a copy of what was written to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses and that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. So the scribes are summoned, and they write this new edict to revoke the old one. And it's commanding everyone that they are not to attack the Jews. And if there is such an armed force that ignores this edict, that the Jews and those around them are to defend their lives and to annihilate any armed force of any people in any province that might attack them. And to plunder their goods, it says. But as we'll see in chapter 9, those goods are not plundered. So I find that fascinating. We'll get to more of that in chapter 9. But this copy, this decree goes everywhere. And so the Jews were ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So there's people, it seems, still plotting to kill them, but now no one wants to anger the king. So the bulk of the populace who wasn't really on either side, they're going to side with the king. So before they were against the Jews because they're siding with the king's edict. Now they're siding with the Jews because they're once again siding with the king's edict. Just keep in mind, like, it's not just Persians and people of high estate. Like, you have lots of people, and considering the Persians conquered a lot of different peoples, it's not just the Jews who are the only conquered people. Like, there's a lot of conquered peoples, and they have to do what the king says, or they might be wiped out. Because they're thinking like, hey, this isn't good that they're wiping out the Jews, but we might be next if we don't listen. So we need to comply. What other choice do we have? Because if we don't comply, we will be like the Jews no matter what. So they have to do what the king says. But now that things have changed, now it's just saying, well, we'll protect them and destroy the Jews' adversaries. And that way, if there's anyone still harboring anger towards them, that they are destroyed instead. Because it's not racial at this point. It's not genocide. It's simply, well, these people are trying to wipe out these people, still commit genocide, and they're still trying to commit genocide, and we need to stop it, that they're defending their lives. So that's what's happening here. That's a decree that's going out there. I like too how it gets very specific, how there's swift horses that were especially bred to carry letters everywhere. I never really thought of that, but I'm sure that was pretty common throughout most of history, at least nations that used horses, because you're still going to breed things for specific purposes. So some horses are just bred to be faster than others. I never really thought of that much detail. It's interesting. It goes into that. But I'm sure that happened in many places. So the couriers, they go out, and the decree was issued from Susa, then from to India to Ethiopia. 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So Mordecai, he goes out in these royal robes. So he's showing that, hey, we have power, and that we are helped by the king. And so Mordecai is clearly second in command, or at least being being rewarded for all the crap that was basically thrown at him throughout these couple of days. And so like the people are saved, and that everyone or the Jews will be okay now. And that there's also a celebration. So we go from sackcloth and ashes, they're mourning the fact that they're about to die, to rejoicing. So they have a feast and a holiday. This will become known as Purim, which will be explained in the next chapter. And I'll get more into how Purim is still celebrated to this day. But there's gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. So you have people declaring themselves Jews just to get in on this holiday. And they're also thinking, well, the Jews are protected. They're in good standing with the king, so it's good just to consider yourself a Jew. So especially like Edom and the Ammonites and Moab, those are smaller countries that we sometimes talk about in the Old Testament, but they're all bordering Israel. And like Babylon and Persia, they wipe everybody out. It's not just the Jews. They go through and they conquer all these kingdoms. So there'd be theoretically Edomites and Moabites and Ammonites in Persia as well. And if the average Persian can't really tell an Edomite from an Israelite, then they may as well call themselves Jews and be rewarded. And so they're declaring themselves Jews. Maybe that's just to get in on the celebrations, to get on the goods. But hopefully some of them also come to faith. They learn more about the Jewish religion and learn more about God. So this would be another God indicator here. Because like I said, the word God never shows up in here. So Mordecai trusts that God would save his people, and here people are becoming Jews. Kind of how God wanted way back in Exodus with the law of Moses, that they would see the Jewish people as a kingdom of priests and also worship God the way they were. So we also have some reminders of other Old Testament texts, very faint reminders, but still something at least. So reminding us that there are other books in the Bible. Esther is weirdly isolated like that, I feel. Outside of the fact that Jews somehow got to Persia, there really isn't much other references to other books in Esther. It's one of the latest books in the Old Testament. And Esther is one of the few Old Testament books nowhere quoted in the New Testament as well. That's also another point, why Esther's kind of weird and why it doesn't get talked about a whole lot. But we talked about a lot of that in the first section. There's many people claiming to be Jews, and it's kind of just to protect themselves, because like the other thing too that's about to happen is the Jews are going to destroy their enemies by edict of the king. And so it'll also be favorable if you're not a Jew. Well, I am a Jew. I'm not one of those guys who wants to hurt you. Please don't come and hurt me. I just want to live my life in peace. So it's kind of like last week, they're going to say, hey, we aren't Jews. We're going to go fight the Jews like the edict says. This week we are Jews. Please don't kill us. So they're just trying to find peace. And if you're dealing with people with swords and weapons all the time, yeah, you just want to have as much peace as possible. Modern day illustration of this. We have the odd coup or almost coup that happened in Russia over this last weekend. And I was reading some internet comments wondering how the Russians, like the civilians, so quickly turned on their own country. But you don't understand, like the Wagner group, the mercenaries, they were driving tanks and 25,000 men into these cities, all armed to the teeth. And presumably most of Russia's forces are down in Ukraine. So there isn't many forces to really protect the people. And so, well, you either get wiped out by this mercenary group or you accept them and wave at them as they drive by. So you pick the option that keeps you alive. You're on whichever side has the gun. And it's something I think similar going on here, because it's for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them, because they realized the Jews now had power. They went from the little guys to the big guys, the little dog to the big dog. And you're always going to get in line with the big dog if you want to value your own life. And so that's what's going on in Russia. What's confusing about the whole Russian thing is we don't know really how peace was made, how they dropped all the mutiny charges, and then how the mercenaries ended up in Belarus. Like that's unclear, at least to us civilians. I'm sure our intelligence knows a bit more, but they're not going to release that publicly. But I found that interesting that it's similar to what we're reading here, where people oftentimes just go with whoever wields the biggest stick. Power really is all that it is, all there is in the ancient world, and even today, that's still true. So that's what's happening there in chapter 8. Chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them. For the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and satraps and the governors and royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parshadantha and Dalphon and Aspatha and Paratha and Adalia and Aradatha and Parmashtath and Arusai and Aradai and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder. So it's the day that the Jews were going to be destroyed, and then the reverse occurs where they gain mastery over those who hate them. And even in the citadel, in the capital, they kill 500 people, including all of Haman's sons. The other big note is that the officials of the king also help the Jews out. And the reasoning for that is Mordecai is their boss now. So it looks good to please your new boss. So the king really likes Mordecai, seems to want to keep him around for a while. So unless you're going to plan some plot to assassinate Mordecai, which the last one didn't go over too well, you may as well work for him and not against him. And so they work for him by slaying the Jews' enemies. And so the Jews are saved. And the last people who might attack them, Haman's sons, they are also put to death alongside the other 500 men. So there's also this distinction as well, where the Jews, not just the men, but also women and children were going to be killed, and also all their goods be plundered, where you get the idea, not only is this genocide, but they're also taking things, where they're bribing the very people to get them to want to kill. Whereas this time around, the women and children were spared, and they didn't even lay hands on the plunder, even though they could have. So this is showing that there's a difference here, where it purely was out of self-defense, and they're going to go and celebrate and party anyway. So no matter what, they're okay. And they also gained status. That's the thing that was gained. While they're not gaining the material plunder, they did gain status. If your second in command is one of your own people, then. Or if the second of command to the king is one of your own people, the king's not going to harm you. There might be laws written for your own people, in fact. It's why the fear of the Jews fell on these people, because it's pointless to stand against such a powerful race within Persia now. So what the power dynamics basically change overnight, and now they're living in this new reality where Mordecai now has the power. Once again, thinking about that coup or that near coup in Russia. The mercenaries were marching on Moscow. Chances are they wouldn't have taken over. There would have been like 25,000 men's not enough, presumably, to take Russia. But the coups are successful. In other countries, there are successful coups, and the power dynamics change overnight. A bunch of people get executed, and if you're a civilian though, with no part on either side, well, you're just going to keep working for whoever's in power over you, whoever's wielding the gun. So that's what's going on in the ancient world here, and what goes on in many places throughout our lands today. Verse 11, that very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have you done in the rest of the king's provinces? What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And as I said, if it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this king's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. So we get a little more description on how those 10 sons of Haman were killed. Because like the first paragraph makes it sound like they're killed in the fighting. But remember, these were sons of a very high-ranking advisor. So they're rich. They're not doing the fighting themselves. So they're going to be publicly executed the way most royal officials are, in public by hanging or by guillotine in more modern days. That's what would happen. So these guys wouldn't be doing the fighting themselves. So they're killed in all of this action by being captured, by their forces being destroyed, and then being led out to some gallows and then being hanged. So that's how those sons were killed. And the queen even tells the king what's happening, and that they ask for tomorrow for those sons to be killed, and presumably also to celebrate that they're allowed to be alive, because the Feast of Purim is coming up as well. So it just explains again that people are killed, and that the Jews are protected. Verse 16. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in rural towns will hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for feasting and gladness, as a holiday, and as a day which they send gifts of food to one another. So, all in all, it was 75,000 people were put to death. So that is a lot of people. But on the flip side, I was talking about those Edomites and Ammonites. Those people did not like the Jews. So on one hand, I bet some of them were saying, hey, let's go with the Jews. Let's pretend to be the Jews so that we get these rewards. But on the flip side, there might be a group of them, like especially if there's these rural areas where there might be like a power dynamic where there's a lot of non-Jewish peoples, especially non-Jewish peoples that hated the Jews, that might say, you know what, even though this other edict is telling us not to fight them, let's still fight them. Let's still do it because we don't like them. It's an opportunity to beat up on the people you don't like. And so they're going to take that opportunity. But because the Jews had the backing of the actual government of the Persians, they were always successful. And that 75,000 ended up being put to death. So 500 or 800 in the capital, because you had that extra 300 on in verse 15 there. But a little under 1,000 in the capital, and then another 74 throughout all of the other provinces. So the Jews get relief from their enemies, and it's probably much more peaceful for them in Persia from here on out. Linking this book to other Bible books, Daniel comes to mind, because Daniel, he's in Babylon, but then he works with the Babylonians, but the Babylonians eventually become Persians, or the Persians end up wiping out the Babylonians, I should say. But Daniel, you get the idea. He kind of starts like these traditions of teaching the scriptures. And we have the wise men visiting Jesus several hundred years later. Those wise men come from the east, presumably from Babylon and Persia, from this part of the world. So this is another example of how the Jews could have gained power, and how there's this group of people way out in the east, far away from Israel, who care so much about Jewish beliefs and traditions and prophecies. So most likely this also helps cement various wise men in these courts to eventually, several hundred years later, show up at Jesus's birth, or near his birth, we should say. Okay, next, the Feast of Purim. Verse 20, and Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So this begins a holiday. And so every year they celebrate this the same. And even now to this day, the Feast of Purim is still celebrated by Jewish people. So I'll get more into how it's celebrated at the end of the book, but let's keep reading. So verse 23. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pure, that is, to cast lots, to crush and to destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the term pure. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter and what had faced in the matter and what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and offering all who joined them. Without fail, they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So the book kind of summarizes for us, or this chapter summarizes what the book's all about, that the evil plan gets reversed, and that Haman and his sons are put to death instead of the Jews. And because of all of this, there's a holiday that is started. So Haman was associated with the lots. The book doesn't go into a lot of detail, but you wonder if he helped, like when he cast lots, he was trying to figure out what to do. And the lots fell that he should harm the Jews. And then everything reverses. It seems almost like chance that all these things happen to work. And then Haman ends up being put to death. And so this holiday is called Purim. So pure it is an Assyrian loan word. It's not really a Hebrew word, but then they make it a Hebrew word by adding I am to the end of it. I am in Hebrew is no different than adding S onto a word in English. It just makes it plural. It goes from singular to plural. So pure sounds like a single lot, like one lot. Purim would be many lots. And so it's called the festival of Purim because we're just talking about all the lots that were cast. So that's where the name comes from. It comes from just the concept of lots. But the important thing to know is that it's not random. God was protecting his people, and he was using Queen Esther to accomplish all that he had set out to do. Verse 29. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority, confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them. They had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fast and lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim and was recorded in writing. So it's telling us the letter goes out, telling the Jews to practice this, to celebrate this. But this is an important part of Jewish belief, that these traditions continue onward forever. And this is what makes the Jewish people, that God saves us in Exodus by sending the plagues against Egypt, by walking them across the Red Sea. He saves them here in Esther. And then you go, and it's kind of like almost beginning and end of the Old Testament here, where you have the big salvation event in the Red Sea. And then you have all those times with all the different peoples, throughout all the different kings, like King David and the Philistines, but all the other peoples. I talk about the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, how he protected the Jews against those people as well, all the way into more present times, still very ancient by our standards, but still more present times, end of the Old Testament, how even though he allowed the Babylonians to send them to exile, the Persians were kind to them by allowing them to rebuild the temple and also saving them, God allowing them to be saved from Haman and these evil Persians and evil peoples that wanted to harm them. And so they commemorate a lot of these things with celebrations, with holidays. Like we talked about Exodus, the main celebration is Passover. Passover is what Jesus is celebrating before he's put to death on the cross. So it's all part of the Jewish tradition, what they are to do. So Purim is one of those celebrations. Chapter 10, this is one of the shortest chapters in the Bible. King Xerxes imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, in all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced them. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles, the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. So it tells us where this book is, or where these writings were found. So if you want to know more about Mordecai or more about King Xerxes, you're going to find it in this book. So there's a lot of these history books that get talked about that we don't really have access to anymore. But it's telling us, hey, if you want to know more about the history, go to this particular chronicle. We have not found this book. Most of these other books that get mentioned that aren't in the Bible, they're gone, or they're buried somewhere under a bunch of rocks somewhere. So yet to be discovered, we should say. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't say they're gone. They're yet to be discovered, but we're not finding them. It'd be quite a find to find one of these chronicles of the kings, whether of Persia or of the Jewish kings from Israel. Because when you read Chronicles or First and Second Kings, they say so-and-so's kingship, like his reign, you can see the rest of it described here, but we don't have that book. So we don't entirely know what he all did. But it's just saying, hey, if you want to know more, here's where you find it. And then Mordecai seeks the welfare of his people. So that's Esther. It's a fascinating book because it doesn't mention God, not by name, doesn't say Elohim either, which is the Hebrew for God. So it's very fascinating from that point of view. Like I mentioned with the first chapter, Luther himself, when he was removing certain books from the canon, because he felt like, hey, these don't really establish doctrine a whole lot. There was never a real council about the Old Testament canon, so you could still argue that's still up for debate amongst Christians. Was that ever closed? That's even a debate. Is the canon of Scripture closed? That's a whole can of worms that I probably shouldn't get into when we're closing up. But there's this concept where, hey, what if we did find 3rd Corinthians or something? Because we know Paul wrote other letters to the Corinthians. What if we found that? Would that enter the canon of Scripture? My personal belief on something like that is the ancients would have had access to those books. And so there's a reason why that book wasn't there. It most likely is that it contains some doctrine, but probably not a lot, and probably not more than what was already in what we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians. To give you a little more historical context behind that missing letter, when you read 2nd Corinthians, he references a 3rd letter that we don't seem to have. So if we're taking those references at face value, technically what we call 2nd Corinthians would really be 3rd Corinthians, and that the second letter is just floating around out there somewhere yet to be discovered, or 1.5 Corinthians, you want to call it that. But my take on it is the ancients would have had access to these things. And the fact that the letter wasn't distributed shows that it probably didn't have a lot of doctrine, where it was still useful for Paul's relationship with the Corinthians, but only the Corinthians. Whereas 1st and 2nd Corinthians was useful for that church, but is also useful for us today because it teaches a lot of things about how to be Christians. Especially 1 Corinthians 15 is one of the most important scriptures or one of the most important chapters in the New Testament, because it's setting up the fact that Christ rose from the dead and explaining the importance of the resurrection. It's a vital chapter, if not arguably the most important chapter in the Bible. If you were to separate all the chapters out, you could make an argument 1 Corinthians 15 is even more important than any individual chapter in the Gospels, as crazy as that sounds, because Paul is both asserting the resurrection, saying who witnessed the resurrection, and talk about why the resurrection is important, all in one chapter. So my point is that if there's nothing like that in this missing Corinthians letter, then, well, there's a reason why it was lost. It wasn't that important, even if it did talk about God. So that's another very interesting question. Is the canon of Scripture closed or not? I'm more of the opinion it's closed. We have no one by 2,000 years left alive to verify if Paul or another apostle really wrote the book. Then when it comes to Old Testament books, it's even more time. And so Luther does pull out things like Maccabees, which he says this is important for the history of the Jews, but not so much for Christian doctrine. And so that's why it ends up in the Apocrypha. It's good for Christians to read and study this, but it doesn't necessarily give us any prophecies about the Messiah. It doesn't necessarily set up new doctrine, which is why Luther debates Esther. And reading this, I hope you kind of see why, because there's still great things in Esther, still worthwhile reading. But it doesn't talk about God, and it's a fun story, and especially how Purim is celebrated today. Purim's a fun party. That's what Purim is. And dare I say, by some more puritanical standards, not very pure, because one way it's celebrated is that people drink a lot. The men are commanded to drink wine. If you notice throughout all of Esther, the king is constantly drunk. Just about every single scene, the king is drinking wine and presumably is drunk. At the start of the book, there's that line about how the king just allows everyone to consume as much wine as they want for any reason whatsoever. So you get the idea why Purim is celebrated like this. There's a lot of bawdiness to the celebration of Purim and the reading of Esther during the celebration. So when they go to read Esther, it's a lot of fun because whenever Haman's name is mentioned, everyone in the congregation is meant to boo and scream and make noise to blot Haman's name out from the record, because Haman wished to blot the Jews out from the record of reality, from the record of the earth. So they blot Haman's name out from the record of the reading. And there's a lot of masquerading. It's kind of like Halloween where you go and dress up, maybe as Mordecai, maybe as Esther. But the point is, it's a big party, big celebration. It's a 2-day celebration, so you need the second day to recover from the first day usually. That's the kind of thing that's kind of celebration that Esther brings about. You can see why then it's going to hold a little bit lower status than the rest of the Bible. But like I said, it still is an important book, just understanding Jewish history and who they are as a people. And even in modern day times, this book gets talked about a bit more in Jewish times just because we're post-Holocaust, where that happened. Like genocide happened in the Holocaust of the Jewish people, and many more too. And once the Nuremberg trials happened, all those people responsible for the Holocaust were put to death. Then it was kind of like Esther reborn almost, where it's similar to how those 10 sons of Haman were hanged. All of Hitler's confidants and right-hand men were also put to death. There's a lot of parallels between Esther and the Nuremberg trials. And so that's why Esther's still celebrated, because this wasn't the first time the Jews were, there was an attempted genocide or successful genocide against the Jews. So that's why Esther's still important. We can debate how much doctrine is in Esther, if it should be in the canon or not, but it's been in the canon for 2,000 years. It's just going to sit in there still. It's not harmful to read the book. It just, we don't get a ton of theology out of it. So to tell us where you're going, tell everyone where we're going to Galatians, because I kind of want to contrast what I mean by, like, there's not a lot of foundational doctrine. I'm like, I need to do a book that really shows what I mean when I say, like, some books have more doctrine than others. Like where Esther's on one end, so we're going to go to the other end of the pendulum swing here, the other end of the spectrum. We're going to do Galatians. We already did Romans a few months ago, about a year ago, probably by now. But Galatians is also extremely, extremely high on that doctrine list. So by how much, if you're trying to order it that way. So Galatians, Isaiah was my other choice, but I don't know if I'm ready to tackle Isaiah yet. That one intimidates me. I'll admit that. It's the longest book in the Bible. So we'd be there for we're going to be there a long time when we do Isaiah. But I want another shorter book because what my goal is to get through all the Bible once, not in order, but just get through all the books. I'm marking down which books we're doing. I want to do a shorter New Testament book because I wanted to show like what a strong doctrine book looks like from Paul. And then I want to sit more time in the Old Testament because there's just simply more Old Testament books than New Testament. So we got to start knocking out some of these Old Testament books. I wouldn't mind knocking out several minor prophets. Those don't take long at all. But they're all in there. You're gonna work through them. They're very interesting when you read them. We should read the minor prophets more. It's fun going through all this. Also, the other note is that this doesn't change too much for the online. This is more for the in-person study, but this does affect the online, is that we're consolidating the 2 times. So right now, we have online at 11 and then in-person covering the same material at 6:30. We're moving the in-person to 11. This will not change the online. All I'm doing is I'm picking up this laptop I'm teaching from and moving it to the fellowship hall. And actually, if anything, if you only attend online, it should benefit you because if someone asks a question, I can reiterate that question to the online audience and then answer it. And so you should be able to hear some of those questions, or even if you can't hear someone else talking, I can just repeat the question and then answer it. So that's what we're going to change. I'm trying to see if we can get more people to attend in person with the 11 o'clock time. So that's the goal with that. I'll announce that on Sunday as well. So Galatians and only at 11. But like I said, that affects more the in-person than it does the online. But Esther is a lot of fun. Purim is a really interesting festival to read about. So there, of course, there's feasting, drinking of wine. Everyone's in, or not everyone, but a lot of people are in costume, especially kids. And the big thing is when you read Esther in church, in the synagogue, you make sure and boo and scream and hiss when Haman's name is read, and then when Mordecai's name is read, you cheer because he's kind of one of the heroes. So that there's some fun. Like everything about Esther is body, but it's supposed to make you smile and have fun because the Jews were saved on this day, and so we celebrate in accordance with that Persian edict from all those years ago. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Jesus, yes, thank you for giving us these chances to celebrate. You give us life, so help us to celebrate and enjoy the life you've given us. Moreover, even when we don't feel like celebrating, there will come a day where we will know nothing but celebration when you bring us into your kingdom, which has no end. So help us just to find those times in life where we can celebrate and enjoy our lives with one another. We ask in your name, amen. Thanks. Really looking forward to Galatians. Looking forward to next week and seeing how things work. There might be some bumps in the road with bringing people into the online, but I'll figure it out. We'll all work it out. See you next week.